So we've discussed gender performativity in previous lectures, and gender performativity is one of the most influential, I guess, queer concepts or concepts from queer and feminist theory in this time period. And Judith Butler is interested in how performativity is the power of language to affect change in the world. Language does not simply describe the world, but may instead or also function as a form of social action. For Austin, performative language included speech acts such as promising, swearing, betting, and performing a marriage ceremony. Performativity of gender is a stylized repetition of acts, an imitation or miming of the dominant conventions of gender. Butler argues that the act that one does, the act that one performs, is, in a sense, an act that's been going on before one arrived on the scene. So Judith Butler gives the example of the scene of a child being born, the doctor saying it's a girl or it's a boy. What Butler argues is this is not a reflection of reality as such. A doctor could say anything, a doctor could say nothing. Uh, the language is performative. It enunciates or it interpolates the subject into the social order as a gendered subject. So the looking at something like genitalia and saying it's a girl or it's a boy is not something that must happen. It isn't really scientific. I mean, someone could uh, make a declaration uh, of something else that is apparent about the child's body. So gender itself then is a kind of enactment of power. And it's enactment of power against the body that will lead to a whole set of gender performatives that will occur across a life course. One could see it as positive, but that is one's choice to see it as like to see gendering as positive. The problem is that one doesn't have a choice. So I suppose if you think about anything that involves a set of forced social norms, you could see these social norms as positive, but you don't really have a choice. You must kind of work with gender in some way. And many people try to transgress gender throughout the course of their lives. They try to transition or they try to uh, avoid gendered language or gender itself, but they will often be policed in various ways. So the article from everyone, the syllabus looks at kinship and queer kinship as a set of performatives.
This is a short video introducing you to some background ideas in the work of Judith Butler. Butler is one of those figures who's really at the heart of gender theory for a variety of different disciplines, including philosophy, but not limited to philosophy, and whose work is also really applied and brought up in many cases outside of academic contexts. For the purposes of this video, I wanted to give you an introduction into some of the philosophical concepts that Butler is working with. Butler's work is really rooted in philosophy in a way that is sometimes not drawn attention to. So I really want to do precisely that here, to draw attention to philosophical antecedents and roots in her work. And I want to do that by drawing attention to three different philosophical traditions that she is working with. The first is the philosophical tradition of the 19th century German philosopher Hegel. Butler wrote her PhD thesis on Hegel, which became her first book. And why do I mention that here? We're not reading Hegel in this class. You might not know who Hegel is. Who cares? Well, the reason I mention Hegel here is because you've actually already encountered his ideas in an indirect way. And that's through Beauvoir's idea that being is becoming. Both Beauvoir and Butler are steeped in the work of Hegel, and Hegel is the philosopher who is most famously associated with this idea that being is becoming. Hegel asserts that being develops historically, so there's no essential human essence to who we are, but rather our human condition is coded and shaped by the historical circumstances in which we live. Being comes about through a process of becoming. This will be the basis for Butler's theory of gender performativity, but it's not the only basis. The second philosophical tradition that Butler is working with here is that of phenomenology, which is, of course, a philosophical tradition that we have already encountered. One of the reasons that I wanted to assign this essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, here is because it's a little known early essay by Butler. It comes out before Gender Trouble, which is her main text on performativity. And it's actually really the first place where she's working out this theory of performativity. And as you can see from reading this text, she does so precisely in terms of phenomenology, drawing on Beauvoir's idea that one is not born but becomes a woman, as well as Merleau-Ponty's idea that when we think about the body as sexed, we also think about the body as sexed within a historical context. So one thing that Butler really draws on in this essay, you can see this around page 521, but a number of other places, is the idea that the body is a historical idea, which is one that comes from Merleau-Ponty. When we say that the body is a historical idea, it doesn't mean that I don't feel like my body is material. It doesn't even mean that my body isn't material, right? But it means rather that my material body is coded, understood in such a way that reflects the historical sedimentation of a particular society. So for phenomenology, as you'll recall, the first person perspective of how you experience yourself is paramount. But that's not in opposition to a historical or perhaps a sociological understanding of who you are. The third philosophical tradition to mention in the context of Butler's conception of performativity is speech act theory. Speech act theory is the origin of the concept of performativity. And Butler's incredible intervention here is into the idea that we can apply insights from speech act theory to gender. And that's a really surprising and super influential move to make. Now, speech act theory comes out of a 20th century tradition of Anglo-European philosophy of language. Sounds boring as heck, right? Well, it's actually pretty interesting here because speech act theory, and in particular the work of one theorist, J.L. Austin, divides common statements into two different categories: constatives and performatives. A constative speech act is what we do most of the time. These are declarations, statements of fact. So if I say it's raining outside, that is a constative. So most of what we do on a day-to-day basis is wrapped up in this particular kind of speech act. Constative speech acts echo existing states of affairs. They talk about what is the case already, and they just designate it or express it. This is most of what we do in our everyday speech. But there's this other category that's actually pretty rare in our everyday speech called performatives. Performatives, instead of echoing existing states of affairs, actually bring about new states of affairs through their very utterance. The classic example here, which is a pretty interesting example from a perspective of philosophy of gender, is the example of an officiant at a wedding who says, "I now pronounce you man and wife." This is the example that Austin gives. Very classic sort of heteronormative example, right? If I am endowed with the authority to pronounce somebody man and wife, then my utterance actually brings about their marriage, right? Promises also count as performatives. Signatures count as performatives. But the thing is, I have to have the right conditions for a performative to work. So if I say I now pronounce you man and wife, just like right now in my office, nothing's happening, right? Or if I say it to two friends and I don't actually have the authority because I haven't like gone through that process of being an official officiant of a wedding, then That's not a performative, right? And so performatives bring about states of affairs, but under the conditions where somebody has the authority to make a statement. How then does all of this apply to gender? Well, Butler says that gender is performative. And what she means by this is not that we perform our gender in a theatrical sense, right? In a theatrical performance, I bring myself as an individual into a scene where I adopt a role. So I have myself and then I have my role. The reason that this doesn't work in thinking about gender performativity is that it presumes a self that's behind the role. And Butler's whole point is that there is no such distinction and there's no such self behind the role. When we're thinking about gender as performative, we have to think about it with this background of the theory of speech acts. Because what's happening in gender performativity is that I am bringing about the reality of gender by uttering my gender. But uttering my gender doesn't mean just speaking, right? And so Butler is extending this claim from philosophy of language into our very embodiment. This is a hybrid of phenomenology and speech act theory. So my way of performing my gender isn't just in making a statement about my gender. It's also in the expression of my physical gestures, right? My way of walking, my way of dressing, my way of speaking, all of these types of things and more, the way that I'm attributed as being a woman by others. For Butler, it's not that the theatrical model of performance is entirely wrong. It's just that the way we usually think about it is wrong. So, for instance, if I take a conception of theatrical performance that doesn't presume a self that just adopts a role, and I have a more integrated sense of the way that the actor and role are a single unit, then that actually is pretty close to what Butler means by performativity. Performativity happens within a broader social context, in the same way that my saying, I now pronounce you man and wife, only operates as a performative in a broader social context where there are two people in front of me, presumably a man and a woman, and I have the official authority to pronounce them married. The reason I really want to emphasize this is that it's super easy to misunderstand Butler as saying gender is a performance and take that in the usual sense that we mean performance. And I just want to draw your attention in this context to the second paragraph on page 520, where Butler writes the following. This is the second sentence of that paragraph. In opposition to theatrical or phenomenological models which take the gendered self to be prior to its acts, I will understand constituting acts not only as constituting the identity of the actor, but as constituting that identity as a compelling illusion, an object of belief. This goes back to some of our claims about social construction last week, where we said that social construction is, of course, not natural, right? But that also doesn't mean it's fictional. It's existing sort of in this space in between the natural and the fictional, where the social construction has real material effects, but it's also an object of belief. One final thing I want to note here is that unlike a speech act performative, which just happens one time, gender performativity is necessarily ongoing. And so I constitute myself as a woman through the repeated performance of my gendered embodiment. Repetition is crucial to Butler's worldview here.
Are you over 45 years old and live in Canada? Then watch this. This month only, we are looking for 500.
Hi, today I'm going to talk about Gilles Deleuze's 1990 essay, Postscript on Societies of Control.
So, performativity then is a set of enactments of that give the illusion of a stable identity, something that exists, but it's actually what Butler would argue is that gender itself involves a series of rituals and repetitions that give the illusion of a natural gender identity. If a word, writes Butler, in this sense might be said to do a thing, then it appears that the word not only signifies a thing, but that this signification will also be an enactment of the thing. It seems here that the meaning of a performative act is to be found in this apparent coincidence of signifying and enacting. The title of J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words poses the question of performativity as what it means to say that things might be done with words. The problem of performativity is thus immediately bound up with a question of transitivity. What does it mean for a word not only to name, but also in some sense to perform, and in particular to perform what it names? On the one hand, it may seem that the word, for the moment, we do not know which word or which kind of word, enacts what it names, where the what of what it names remains distinct from the name itself and the performance of that what. After all, Austin's title queries how to do things with words, suggesting that words are instrumentalized in getting things done. Austin, of course, distinguishes between illocutionary and perlocutionary acts of speech, between actions that are performed by virtue of words and those that are performed as consequences of words. So it's interesting to think about the relationship between word and action. And we discussed Sabah Mahmood's work yesterday and the woman life freedom protests in Iran. So, what is the difference between actions that are performed by virtue of words and actions that are performed by consequence of words? So, if we were to describe something as being performed by virtue, then what by virtue means is it is an idiom that means because of or as a result of. So, actions are performed because of words. And then there are actions that are performed as a consequence of words. And so, if actions are performed by virtue of words, because of words, then they are also performed. I mean, so what would this mean if we thought of the phrase "it's a girl" or "it's a boy"? So the action of becoming a girl, or being a girl or a boy, is because of or as a result of these words. Um, so then we come to the phrase performed as a consequence of words. So if something is consequential, or what consequence then means, so consequence is the result or effect of an action or event. So I guess what is being troubled here in Judith Butler's writing is this distinction between action and speech, and between identity and language, and also real action. So when someone says it's a girl or it's a boy, there is no action that has been really taken. And so we could say that because of these words, someone enacts a whole set of performances or performatives, to give the impression that they are a girl or a boy. And this is different than being a girl or a boy because some action has been taken. What is interesting is to think about is the relationship between gender and sexual identity. That if one wants to enact a series of performatives as a cisgender heterosexual man or woman, then obviously there are actions that are taken: romantic love, sexual relationships. But you could still obviously identify in other ways. But the point is that most of these enactments of action, um, that gender is performed as a consequence of action. Sorry, that um, so if gender was this perlocutionary act of speech, it would be performed because these words lead to action, or there has been some action, uh, like sex or sexual desire. Um, so then we come back to the idea of it's a girl or it's a boy, and someone is declaring gender to exist, and it is because of words, which means it's not real. So by virtue of words, because I've said this, then you do this. But I could say something else. So if I was to actually then enact an action, would you have to then perform in gender? This is why a lot of feminist theorists and queer theorists have always been concerned with rape, or with child abuse, with sexual abuse and gender identity. Particularly, we talked about Iran and the rates of child sexual abuse against Iranian girls is very high. This is also true of India throughout the global south. Um, the rates of child abuse have always also existed. The statistics of child abuse in Canada are obviously existent. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report documents the ways that the Canadian university system, or the Canadian, sorry, school system, uh, was complicit in the abuse of Indigenous peoples, including child abuse. So, if gender is performed by virtue of words, because of words, obviously gender can change. It is malleable. Someone could say something else. Um, what changes are our laws in the country of Canada? So Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and to the Criminal Code. So when you are in Canada, when you are a Canadian and you even travel to other countries as a Canadian, you are protected by Canadian laws, including the right to be non-binary and transgender, and including the right to use different pronouns and to declare yourself in whatever way that you want as a gendered subject. So those are Canada's laws, and obviously, by virtue of words, one would have to follow the law, or by virtue of words, one could be fired from their job, or other things could happen, bad things, by virtue of words. So if gender is performed as a consequence of words, so consequence means that uh, there has been some action that is taken. So the idea of there being a consequence of words is really about action preceding speech. It's like an action that has been taken against someone. So if gender was a consequence of words, then could gender be used as a tool of, say, rape? Yes, and this is what really troubles a lot of feminist and queer theorists and human rights activists, or commentators about um, rape, that rape can actually be a consequence of gender identity. So, by virtue of words, if you were named as a woman, can your gender then become a consequence of these words, an action, and a whole series of actions taken against you? And this is what I think is interesting about about this difference between illocutionary and perlocutionary acts of speech. I also think that it is disturbing that by virtue of words you could be called a woman, and then actions can be performed against you as a consequence of words. This sense that someone would want actions performed for them is not something that I think is actually true in the modern capitalist world. I think that this desire that someone would have to have actions performed for them as a woman or a man is actually what happens after they have been prevented from having the legal right to participate fairly in modern capitalism. So, if performativity requires a power to affect or enact what one names, then who will be the one with such a power, and how will such a power be thought? How might we account for the injurious word within such a framework? The word that not only names a social subject, but constructs that subject in the naming, and constructs that subject through a violating interpolation. So if I call someone a Palestinian, by virtue of words, because of words, they are a Palestinian. They're born in Palestine. I name them to be Palestinian. I give them some sort of, I don't know, maybe they could get a travel document, um, at least Wi-Fi, maybe, and they could have this name, a Palestinian. So then I can then take action against them as a Palestinian because been born in this place. But is it possible to say something else? Could they be declared as a refugee, a stateless person, uh, a friend of Judith Butler? Yes, perhaps they could be. And then are there consequences for calling them those things? Yes, perhaps they are, and perhaps there are lawyers who can use new words and find new legal terms, and then there will be new actions taken against all of those who are not aware of what can happen to them by virtue of words. And as a consequence of the actions that we can take by virtue of words. So Butler states that is it the power of a one to effect such an injury through the wielding of the injurious name, or is that a power accrued through time, which is concealed at the moment that a single subject utters its injurious terms? So is it just one person who will call someone, say, a Palestinian, and by virtue of words can take action against them? No. It could be many people, and it could go on for quite a long time. But by virtue of words, they could be called something else, and they could claim refugee status if the enactment of this term, Palestinian, leads then to one being able to perform actions because they have been called this name, then those actions could be positive actions. Those actions could involve being a Palestinian in the same way that someone has any other cultural or ethnic identity. Uh, they could have a positive experience and not be subject to any violence or crime or hatred. And so someone could have this positive experience. If they do not, and someone wants to seek asylum, can they? Yes. And this is by virtue of words, and it's a consequence or actions that are taken because of new terms and new words, like stateless people. And if we were to think about Judith Butler as a Jewish philosopher who has always described themselves as a Jewish philosopher and whose interest in um, hatred and the use of language and terms to actually enact genocide against people. Judith Butler has always written about and talked about how their interest in this kind of interpolation and injurious naming and injurious action um, comes from their own personal experience as a Jewish American philosopher. And the liberal arts and humanities begins after the Holocaust. Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Karl Marx all wanted to write about injury, moral injury, um, economic injury, psychological injury after the Holocaust. Does the one who speaks the term cite the term, thereby establishing his or herself as the author, while at the same time establishing derivative status of that authorship? Is the community and history of such speakers not magically invoked at the moment in which that utterance is spoken? And if and when that utterance brings injury, is it the utterance or utterer who is the cause of the injury? Or does that utterance perform its injury through a transitivity that cannot be reduced to a causal or intentional process originating in a singular subject? So there is a whole history behind this kind of injury. Um, there are different examples we could use besides gender. We can use examples that I think about in Ontario, a place that I will leave when this class ends. And I will leave it because I've finally gotten my Canadian passport. So when someone enacts this kind of bureaucratic structure of having to fill out the form and actually go to an office and talk to someone, when there are all these kind of terms in place where you have to get references to vouch for your identity. You have to give an employment record for years just to get a passport. And then I can be called a Canadian. So, by virtue of words, I have to then enact all of these performatives to get a Canadian passport. I have to actually get two people who are my references, and they cannot be my spouse or my actual family member. They cannot be like my spouse, like spouses or children. They can't be parents. So they have to be two people who can somehow, I don't know, corroborate with the state that I am who I say I am. But then what if who I am changes and I want to, I guess, sell my passport to a Palestinian? What if in the time that I'm not with these people, I decide to sell my passport to a Palestinian and I use my mind to do this? Um, so what would the references say? Unless I go around telling people. I mean, I guess you who has attended this class might not be my reference because I have just said that. So by virtue of words, now that I have said that, can I be declared to be someone who is not a Canadian? Can actions be taken against me? Can my passport be removed from me? I don't know. It is possible, I guess, because by virtue of words, someone has decided that a person works for a passport office or someone is a cop or works for the government, and they are in a position to say that because I have said something or I've written something down, I then become a citizen again, or I don't, or my passport can be canceled, or I can be policed, or not. And so, who hears the words and how do they understand them? Um, so, if someone is very wealthy, like David Bowie, David Bowie wants to wear a dress. So, by virtue of words, is David Bowie going to be called a whole series of names, beaten and killed? No, because he is David Bowie and he wore a dress. And you can go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is one of my favorite museums in London, England, and you can see that the David Bowie exhibition was there. You can buy a David Bowie tote bag. You can even have David Bowie buttons and badges. If you have any children in your care, you can do the David Bowie makeup on the children and take them to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it will be fun. And so, by virtue of words, if one calls someone a girl or a boy, then they perform under this sign and actions can be taken against them. But by virtue of words, if someone is bequeathed a certain amount of money, if they have a certain amount of capital, then what happens? The relationship between performativity and capital, I think, is one of the most interesting things about identity politics. Critical race theory, queer theory, feminist theory often discusses the ways that words can injure, and that injurious words can also lead to injurious actions. But if one has enough financial capital is this always true? Is it possible that capitalism and money could really trump any sense of kind of force that involves language? The English language itself is not necessarily something that even has to be spoken unless you really need a job and have to work in the English language. But if you had enough capital, then throughout the whole course of your life, could you just live your life without the English language or even without a lot of words that tell you what to do and who to be? Could you avoid this kind of injurious language? Um, and then the question becomes, is Marxism or communism or ideologies that critique, I guess, the acquisition of wealth, are these really important? Would it not make more sense for someone to acquire enough capital like David Bowie, so that they could not necessarily be subject to the kind of humiliation, the kind of degradation that someone would who just transgresses gender on a daily basis, but is not known to the public and doesn't have enough capital to live in a certain neighborhood and to protect themselves with, say, security guards. Um, I guess it is just an interesting question, or it's a question that I have about the relationship between these theories of identity and capital. So while is a community and history of such speakers, right? Butler is not magically invoked at the moment in which that utterance is spoken. Yes, but then how much money does the community of speakers have, and how much money did they have, and how much money will they have in the future, and how much money could they lose because of lawsuits?
Why can't you stay organized?
So in the article about Antigone, um, Judith Butler discusses the ways that this figure of Antigone um, who is a tragic figure, is one that is useful for considering for feminist and queer theory. So Antigone, for Butler and other writers, is a feminist icon of defiance. Um, Antigone proves to be a more ambivalent figure for feminism than has been acknowledged, since the form of defiance she exemplifies also leads to her death. Butler argues that Antigone represents a form of feminist and sexual agency that is fraught with risk. So, the sense that people, I don't know, I guess it is just about the sense of risk too. So if someone uses interest words or interest names, I really want to come back to this question about money. And it's just something that I want to do. So the class will end in a few days. And when you go on to graduate school, you can think about Judith Butler in ways that you want to. But in this sense, if it is it the power of a one to effect such an injury through the wielding of an injurious name, or is that a power accrued through time, which is concealed at the moment that a single subject utters its injurious terms? But the sense that the one who is using the injurious name, I mean, if we were to think about it in relation to gender, that one is called a girl or a boy, it's also about race. So if you go to this like passport office, it is not a passport office that anyone in my family, I think, would go to. Many people I know wouldn't go to it. And it is this passport office that is known for people being extremely racist, particularly against Black Canadians. It's also a passport office that's known to have said extremely transphobic things to people. And it's a passport office that is known to have actually caused people who have existing psychiatric services a great deal of mental distress. It's a passport office where they've hired people who are immigrants to Canada, who often do believe in, say, Orthodox religion or the caste system to scream at people. So this kind of passport office is, I guess, a one who is going to use injurious language against others. But if someone was to actually pay more money, they could obviously pay an extensive amount of money and never have to deal with these people. So the question becomes, does class allow one to evade certain injury? And yes, I would argue that it does. And I guess that's my claim that a lot of the queer movement and the feminist movement and critical race theory often aligns itself with Marxism and conflict theory to look at the kind of liberation of the working class and the ways that the working class should form solidarity with others. But in many ways, the working class really doesn't ever see themselves as the working class. And I would argue that one of the ways that they consistently try to pretend to be the middle class and pretend that they don't need their jobs is by being racist and sexist and heterosexist. So, by virtue of words, one might have been told that this is their job or that they had a job at a passport office. But by virtue of words, actions can be taken from them and they'll no longer have a job, and then their email address won't work, and then they won't get paid. So that is what can happen. And so I would argue that class and money really supersedes all of this kind of idea of injury and the injurious name and the injurious language. Um, the avoidance of false consciousness and the false consciousness of the working class who refuse to form solidarity with others, who often will normalize domestic violence and child abuse under the guise of having a quote middle class family, is perhaps is a choice that one can make by virtue of words. One could uh, use their legal right to privacy and not want to interact with certain people. So essentially, then, what if the utterance brings injury? Is it the utterance or the utterer who is the cause of injury? Or does that utterance perform its injury through a transitivity that cannot be reduced to a causal or intentional process originating in a singular subject? The sense that it could bring injury, but it could lead, I mean, it brings injury in the sense that it will still eventually lead to comedy if one thinks about the class structure. And that is the unfortunate truth about a lot of um, uses of identity politics or uses of kind of gendered or racialized language against the middle class and against those who could obviously travel, leave, but who will just never really be exposed to these people again. The sense that the gendering or the race talk would continue throughout one's life is, I think, about the avoidance of certain people. The problem is with Marx and with thinking about communism and being in support of the working class that if one was to avoid entire sections of, say, the population who really have to constantly sell their labor and are obsessed with having a family that somehow justifies this constant work and their lack of mobility, I would argue that they are the working class, and they often have a really deep-seated emotional, psychological investment in gender and race. And you can see this in the United States of America with the rise of republicanism and the ways that this language of kings and male entitlements to wealth really appeals to working class people. Even if these people have a certain amount of money, one could then avoid them still by not doing business with them. But then over time, if their kind of injury against others in this time period is so great that it was to kind of do injury to one's mind, then obviously they would eventually go out of business or someone would just not want to speak to them, which is really about capital. And so even if someone had a landlord, for example, if you were a renter and you could not afford to own property and your landlord was a woman, or how about a girl? So could your landlord evict you? Yes, yes, they could. And so that is really about, again, injury by virtue of words.
I took two things.
So the example of Antigone is cited in these writings about kinship. And it's interesting to also think about, oh yeah, child abuse was the other example. So by virtue of words, these people are, I guess, parents, and they've declared themselves to be parents using like passport systems, birth certificates. And so then they can take action against you. Yes, but how long does that go on, really? I mean, I suppose one could even get a restraining order at a certain point if someone no, I don't, hasn't made a friend in 60 years and wants to talk, I guess, to someone who was once a child of theirs. Like, when does this end? Like, by virtue of words, if I declare myself to be a free person, can no actions be taken against me by those who are obsessed with entombing others in North America? So, Butler then discusses Antigone. And Antigone is this character from uh, Sophocles' Oedipus. Antigone proves to be a more ambivalent figure for feminism than she has been acknowledged, since the form of defiance she exemplifies also leads to her death. Butler argues that Antigone represents a form of feminist and sexual agency that is fraught with risk. Moreover, Antigone shows how the constraints of normative kinship unfairly decides what will and will not be a livable life. Butler explores the meaning of Antigone, wondering what forms of kinship might have allowed her to live. Along the way, she considers the work of such philosophers as Hegel, Lacan, and Irigaray. How, she asks, would psychoanalysis have been different if it had taken Antigone, the post-Oedipal subject, rather than Oedipus as its point of departure? If the incest taboo is reconceived so that it does not mandate heterosexuality as its solution, what forms of sexual alliance and new kinship might be acknowledged as a result? So I'll still come back to the idea of capitalism because the class is almost over, and I will try to leave this place, Canada. So by virtue of words, we are comrades. And so because we have been called, I guess, comrades in the Russian language, there are actions we take together. So by virtue of words, Canada's original white settlers came here and planted a flag, and now they are somehow the working class. So could I use other terms to describe them as the working class, or as the white working class, or as upper caste Hindus who did not really want to live in India after the passage of laws against caste discrimination? Could they be described as white working class British and Irish people who didn't want to live in England after the passage of comprehensive laws like the Equality Act, which means that Sadiq Khan is the mayor of London and Rishi Sunak was the prime minister? So could they have been people who actually fled equality and came here to call themselves the working class when they are actually fascists? Is that possible? And so if they are fascists and they are not my comrade, why would I ever want to take any action with them or even talk to them again? The sense that people can just call themselves a name and we all support them is not necessarily true, which is why I can declare my gender identity to be whatever I want it to be. But I don't think that people necessarily have to do anything for me. They could if they believe that I need some sort of money for something. They could help me, they could give me money, but we don't all have to just give each other money.
Things that I love, dancing and dogs, and I made them into a successful business.
In her book Antigone's Claim, Kinship Between Life and Death, Judith Butler turns to the figure of Antigone as a potential exemplar of feminine resistance to state power, deviating from the trend of seeking state authority for feminist policy aims. However, Butler finds something different from what she had anticipated, and this deviation becomes a central theme as she explores the constitutive difference within Antigone. Antigone, born from an incestuous bond, exists within and outside the norms of kinship. Her incestuous genealogy causes a sliding of identifications, creating a crisis in representation. Antigone's heritage and her father's curse seem to condemn her to a living death, making her live in the tomb even before any banishment occurs. Butler sees this death in life as an allegory for those whose alternative kinship arrangements render them culturally unintelligible. Antigone's uncanny existence and her troubling of the representative function prevent her from becoming a stable representative of political resistance. Nevertheless, she has been repeatedly pressed into representative service by various thinkers. However, what she represents, according to Butler, is kinship as the sphere that conditions the possibility of politics, without ever entering into it. Butler explores the interpretive faltering that occurs when Antigone is framed as a representative of kinship at the threshold of the social. Antigone represents the aporia of representation, being representative of the unrepresentable. She represents the deformation and displacement of kinship, challenging the reigning epistemes of cultural intelligibility. Butler examines whether this disturbance of the relationship between kinship and cultural intelligibility grants the possibility of social transformation. Antigone's liminal positioning both opens and closes the potential for her to mark a transformational political resistance. In Butler's analysis, Antigone represents a politics of mourning and a claim to the right to publicly mourn, which serves as a political grievance. The intertwining of mourning and plaint in the semantic range of grief and grievance is explored, highlighting how Antigone both haunts the field of power that excludes her and is haunted herself, marked by a form of social melancholia resulting from that exclusion. The question arises as to whether Antigone resists state power, or if the power of the state is ultimately resistant to Antigone's resistance. Butler argues that Antigone's claim can only be articulated through an appropriation of the language of sovereign agency, even though she is barred from accessing it herself. While Antigone may not achieve the effect of sovereignty she seeks, her claim has a performative impact that destabilizes the terms of exclusion. Butler concludes that Antigone acts, speaks, and becomes someone for whom the speech act is a fatal crime. However,
So much like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's writings, regarding the subaltern and can the subaltern speak? Antigone is this figure of feminist defiance whose action leads to her death. And Butler, however, is interested in the ways that kinship did keep her alive. And the article from the syllabus looks at the relationship between performativity and kinship. Um, so iterability or citationality is also a term that Judith Butler uses, and it is about repetition. So, in the context of literary and philosophical theory, particularly in the work of Jacques Derrida, iterability refers to the capacity of a sign or text to be repeated or reproduced in different contexts, while still being recognizable as the same sign or text, yet also altered in a new context. So, the constant repetition of, say, certain language over time and space, like gender being repeated, not just in one office or not just in one space, but everywhere over the life course, even in different countries, across borders, is about the iterability of gender. Um, Money is also something that people have heard about in one context or another. The law is also truly something someone has heard about. But the unfortunate problem with the law is that many people haven't even really heard about the law. If you were to think about the extrajudicial killing of people like Mahsa Amini, George Floyd, the use of fake cops like passport officers, airline attendants, security guards, who all kind of become the police. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it wasn't just the police who could, I don't know, the actual I was in London, England, and the actual British Metropolitan Police don't really have time to go around and check to see if, I don't know, black teenagers are wearing their mask properly, or if women who you can tell are wearing, I don't know, a short skirt are also wearing their mask. Like this sense that the general public wants to police would make sense to anyone who looks at child abuse statistics or who just understands that people cannot live their lives. And this is probably, I don't know, it's probably also about their lack of ambition to really do anything else with their lives, whether it's about money or maybe they could be like Antigone and just die in a hail of glory as some sort of activists, even a suicidal martyr. But no, they just want to be fake cops. So I guess they have nothing to lose but their chains, but I don't know. People could actually lose their mind with fake cops, many of whom are the amazing working class. A sense that false consciousness for Marx will always lead to a life of misery for the working class and will actually cause them to enact violence against themselves, against their families, against their own children, is really about this sense of kind of patriotism and loyalty to the state that the working class have to the point that they would actually be fake cops. And some of them, obviously, if you were to think about a lot of the literature, which someone could read, which is not on the syllabus, but is part of the syllabus for other classes, about the relationship between white supremacy and class. Um, David Roediger wrote a book many, many years ago called The Wages of Whiteness. And in this book, Roediger argues that white people get a wage for being white. And this often prevents them from having any meaningful solidarity with anyone else who is in their class position throughout the whole course of their lives. I would also argue that gender identity, masculinity, femininity, cisnormativity also allows someone to have this sense of arrogance or this sense of like almost capital. It is a form of capital in what critical race theorists and gender theorists would call social capital. Um, the term the term racial capital is used to describe the ways that someone has privilege or power, and they can use their race or skin color as a form of capital. This is also true of gender identity. And so when one has this kind of illusory form of capital, it often causes them to feel as though they are more than working class. And this kind of iteration of norms could be particularly vicious on the part of people who really do not want to see themselves as working class or as in solidarity with anyone who's in their class position. And this is the wage of whiteness and white supremacy and white privilege for David Roediger. One can obviously think about this in terms of gender. The entire feminist movement is often defamed from the mouths of those who could be not only a wife, but a pretty wife. And this is the dream that people dream in the so-called first world. And so, again, this kind of capital, which is gendered and racial capital, is a wage, and it's a wage of whiteness for many who can benefit from both gender privilege and racial privilege and will not necessarily ever form solidarity with those who are actually in their own class position, and therefore they will never receive any liberation from work and from the alienation that is caused by labor and class antagonism. This is just a basic Marxist argument, but it is also the problem with thinking about capital is really about thinking about money and the ways that money works. So when someone is a customer, are they always right? By virtue of words, you'll get what you pay for. If you try to do things that are defamatory to any person who has more capital than you, social capital, economic capital, um, the kind of capital that it would take to have a lawyer, what would happen by virtue of not words, but money and power? So we've discussed rape culture, and if bodily violence, rape, um, impoverishment, trying to remove people physically or even from jobs is going to be used because by virtue of words you can call someone a woman or a Pakistani or whatever you want to call them, then I think that money and capital should be used against people, and particularly often, unfortunately, against the white working class and against all of the arrogance that they have somehow developed because of, I don't know, cheerleading for life is not something that I would think of as impressive as a life. And so I don't really care necessarily about the white working class. And I don't care about them because of their enactments of injurious speech and action against others who often have more money and more capital than them and who have actually chosen for some reason to be part of some sort of left-wing academic system. And in the future, I do not think that anyone who is middle class and a person of color or middle class and a woman or middle class and a queer person should form solidarity with the white working class or do anything that involves the left wing. If one could use their financial capital to never interact with the white working class or with anyone who is working class, this would benefit them. And this is obviously true of the queer and transgender community. The kind of injury that one does to others because of gender identity um, could obviously be prevented if they were fired from their job, but what is much easier is for people to avoid buying things, to avoid unpleasant experiences with those whom they do not know, and so they can therefore stop buying things. And if you are the kind of person who really needs to sell things, I guess, to pay rent or stay alive, then one could try to do their job to please others, including others who might not have certain forms of cisnormative or gender or racial capital, but they might have financial capital that you could have used to pay your rent. So we've discussed rape culture in previous classes. I will play this video clip about lesbian bars. So there were once a lot of lesbian bars that made cities and made people and made the economy a lot of money. And they've increasingly closed down. And New York City is one of the only cities that has lesbian bars, and so does London. New York City and London, England are the most expensive cities in the world, and they often pay people, and specifically working class people, the highest amount of money that someone could make in service. They also offer some of the best and most efficient protections from the police and the best security cameras, and they do have lesbian bars. And so, kinship and queer kinship for the author of this week's article is something that challenges um, kind of colonial ideas of anthropological kinship. And so, in the past, when a lot of the anthropologists who are most well cited were white, heterosexual Christians, specifically Americans and British people who were obsessed with their own kind of kinship networks. And so they saw themselves wherever they went, or they saw crime. And so, obviously, queer kinship networks exist and involve chosen families. And so this is a video clip called Searching for the Last Lesbian Bars in America.
Imagine being able to build anything just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44.
So the lesbian bar uh, forms the basis, or it informs, or it is part of, I guess, queer kinship and what authors have termed queer kinship. Or I would like to argue that the lesbian bar is part of broader networks of queer kinship. Um, and one of the reasons that queer kinship obviously exists is as a response to potential injury, rape, and murder. So we discussed rape in great detail, specifically uh, in theory, and we also talked about it in relation to the prevalence of rape, particularly in the global south. And the lesbian bar obviously is a response to, or is supposed to be a safe space that prevents sexual assault or violence, which is most often propagated by cisgender heterosexual men against women. So again, I come back to this phrases, which I think are interesting. Um, so after all, Austin's title queries how to do things with words, suggesting that words are instrumentalized in getting things done. Austin, of course, distinguishes between illocutionary and perlocutionary acts of speech, between actions that are performed by virtue of words and those that are performed as a consequence of words. So, again, by virtue of words, um, so actions, say gendered actions, gendered behavior, one takes on a gender, um, and is this kind of gender is performed because of words. You're called a girl or a boy, but you could also call yourself whatever name you want, and then you enact these performatives of gender. And then there are actions that are performed as a consequence of words, because of words. You are told to do this, you are told to do that. The problem is when you think about these kind of acts, illocutionary and perlocutionary acts of speech, then where does rape fit into this kind of paradigm that J.L. Austin is using to discuss acts of speech? So, actions that I perform by virtue of words, I'm told to be a girl or a woman, and I enact all these performatives. And then there are actions that are performed as a consequence of words because of words. So, can I use this, my enactment, my illocutionary performatives as a woman? Can I take action with this? What could I do? I guess I could, I don't know, like what can I actually, I could become part of a feminist movement, I guess. I mean, what is it that I could actually do with this thing, woman? And so the problem is that if I was a man, could I do something and could I take action um, because of words? So I guess the question then becomes does gender identity lead to the normalization of action against sorry, perlocutionary speech acts refer to speech acts that are performed as a consequence of words. So because I am called a woman, then what actions can I take? And what is unfortunate and what is an argument that many queer and feminist scholars would make is that more actions could perhaps be taken against me because of my gender identity. This sense that in the past, where there are certain rituals that I could enact as a woman, actions would have to be then done for me. But the for and the against is where there's often debate within the law. So, for example, if someone arranged me a marriage, it could be referred to as something that is done for me, but it could also obviously be something that I am forced to do and is against my basic human rights and freedom of mobility and bodily autonomy. So we've discussed rape, I think, already in class. So what's interesting about rape is that it is often always historically and still referred to as a gendered crime. So gender neutrality in rape was actually denied by the government of India, which is interesting that they want rape to be considered to be a crime that men commit against women. And um, the gender neutrality, I think the arguments for it are that they think that if the rape law was made gender neutral, that there would be false claims for financial compensation in this time period. Uh, but many transgender and queer activists um, and advocates for women too have argued that gender neutrality is important because rape in the context of India could also be about, it could form the pattern of a larger set of behaviors, including forcing young girls, specifically minorities or what would be deemed to be minorities in the eyes of the law, like religious minorities or people who are poor, into sex work. Um, it is possible that women could assault other women, and what the kind of power dynamics would not be about gender, but would perhaps be about caste or class, and uh, the kind of forced rape of a girl by a woman um, seems rare, but if we think about it in relation to sex work and specifically child sex work and forced sex work, then it is possible that the gender neutrality would allow for different ways to prosecute women who force girls into sex work. Um, it's also possible that, I mean, men raping men is also possible. I guess the problem is then that gender neutrality of rape law, though, could lead to false claims. But the gendering of rape is, I think, also obviously about marriage. Marital rape continues to be legal in India, so it is legal for a husband to rape his wife. And marital rape is uh, is legal because I think of ritual and culture and these marriage systems like the arranged marriage system. So that one could make the case that if you have an arranged marriage system and you are devoutly religious, then these two people who don't know each other are going to marry. They're never going to touch each other or have any bodily contact bodily contact with each other. So they are going to then um, the boy or man in the relationship will essentially have to rape the girl, and it cannot be called rape. Um, I suppose the problem is obviously that many feminists, the entire feminist movement in India has been trying to uh, criminalize marital rape and argue that even in the context of Orthodox religious marriages or arranged marriages, someone obviously has the right to say no and does not have to consent to sexual intercourse or marriage. Um, Running away is actually a really interesting sociological phenomenon in India. And there's a lot of interesting research about running away. Um, India is this massive country, and so people run away from state to state constantly, and they often run away from marriage. Um, it is why, like, India, as I guess the context in which I've done a lot of research about things like rape and homophobia or trans homophobia and lesbophobia in some ways is obviously a really sad place if you look at it in terms of law, because a lot of the laws do not protect the young from the old. They don't protect the poor from the rich, and they don't protect people's sense of autonomy or freedom, individual expression. Uh, but the context of India, which is a country that was once formerly under colonial rule and was once poor, does allow people to have a sense of mobility and a sense of dignity, because one could always find someone who would help a person flee or help them do what they want, particularly because of the population, because of how many people are really poor. Like if someone wanted to run from one end of India to the other, they could, and they could always find someone who would help them do so. They would just really need the agency to do so. And many people don't have the kind of agency that would allow them to do so, or don't want the kind of agency that will allow them to escape marriage, as we've discussed in relation to Saba Mahmood's writings, The Politics of Piety, the repression of individual or carnal desire in favor of a belief in religious order, and a belief in commitment to religious ideals of fidelity, monogamy, marriage, is something that people actually want for themselves. And so the existence of, I guess, those who do not want these things is usually not a societal problem, or a global problem. It, unless one has parents who actually try to force them into a marriage, or really want them to marry, or want them to be heterosexual, someone can be mobile and free. I would argue that India actually has a lot of interesting cases. The feminist movement in India is really a massive movement. So is the transgender and queer movement. And people do constantly help each other kind of flee certain situations. But the affordability of helping someone, or the affordability of finding accommodation or leaving or fleeing, can make it possible for someone to flee um, a situation of grievous injury, forced marriage, abuse. Um, and I guess if you look at the recent election, or if we consider the recent election in the United States of America and the rise of republicanism, money and financial capital will obviously protect certain groups of people, and money and financial capital will always, or is inherited over time, and it's often inherited from one patriarch to another. And it is then passed from one generation to the next, and it is usually passed from one man to the next. And the way that women will access property and capital will just be, it will not be their own choice. One will be put in a certain place and told to do things, like someone who's kind of a marionette who's told to move their mouth and hands around and sit in certain places. So if one does not want to participate in these systems, they would need enough financial capital to flee. This is also true of rape, which could be considered to be grievous bodily injury. So the refusal to criminalize marital rape is obviously also about property. If someone has nowhere else to go, if they have not been encouraged to do well in the university system and no one has supported their individual educational aspirations or career aspirations, and they are forced to marry, then often this marriage will never be called rape. It won't be called forced. It will be called, I don't, it will be a great chance to say thank you to a cisgender heterosexual man who's created a monopoly, which is, I guess, similar to the history of colonialism, and has essentially stolen jobs, stolen educational opportunities, stolen property from everyone, and then forced women to be with them or be homeless. Um, Child abuse is often bad enough the first time. So, in order to refuse to consider rape as a crime of grievous bodily injury and as a hate crime, rapes are written of as unfounded and difficult to prove by the police. The statistics, therefore, do not correspond to the lived experiences of women, non binary, and transgender people who often report high levels of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment in qualitative interviews. Anecdotal evidence, narratives, and dramatizations of routine sexual violence do not match with low rape statistics in cities in the global north. Numbers are falsified by misogyny and the constant revictimization of rape survivors. As Young further writes, the widespread police practice of underreporting rapes also creates significant moral and policy problems. Police often aggressively interrogate and harass rape victims, pressing them to recant their allegations. So I would argue that our attitudes towards rape are about the cisgender heterosexual family and the bequeathment of inheritance from one generation of men to the next, and the kind of placing of women in homes or in places and cities, in offices, the prevention of their mobility so that they can become wives. And this can't be called rape. It has to be called, I guess, marriage, family, society. In other cases, police assure victims that they are busy working on their cases when no actual investigation occurs because the complaint is already labeled unfounded. The police re-victimize by harassing or lying to rape t- or lying to rape victims is unconscionable. So the undercounting and the underreporting of rape and not taking rape seriously is perhaps a consequence of the normalization of heteronormativity and of patriarchy, which allows cisgender heterosexual men overall statistically to make more money, to own more property, and to therefore not only make choices for themselves, but for their wives and their children. One could turn to the law, and the law is about language. So, by virtue of words, one could separate from these structures if they could afford it and if they had other means, other forms of work and housing to make their own choices. And this is why queer kinship also exists. So Judith Butler rightly points to the analogy between language and kinship in Levi Straussian thought. Levi Strauss writes, although they belong to another order of reality, kinship phenomena are of the same type as linguistic phenomena. However, we may not wish to meld the Levi Strauss of elementary structures with the Levi Strauss of the mythologies as a consistent theory of variant, but essentially homolog- homologous systems of communication. Boone, writing with Schneider, has shown that the premises and methods of Levi Strauss's kin and myth analysis are divergent. the prior relying largely on genealogical categories and the later grounded much more in the native's point of view, even if the aim of both is to uncover the universal workings of the human mind and its capacity for symbolic thought. What will be the top eye of queer kinship? Will they devolve from choice or care? Will gay kinship require constitutive prohibitions? Will it be as it evidently is for revelers at gay discos, a practice of freedom, a form of ethical subjectivation? Is it an ambivalent mimicry of heterosexual norms? Or is gay marriage and kinship the sign of a normative subjection, a kind of melancholia, in which persons remain compulsively attached to forms of love from which they have been violently excluded? Why indeed do gay and lesbians continue to subjectivize themselves and their relationships in family terms, where gay mother might refer to lesbian with children or to a drag queen and her coterie of devotees? What does it mean? We will not be able to say without inspection. So, the use of different language in queer communities and in queer networks of kinship is really about the kind of action one can take for and with uh, chosen families. According to Cameron, the crucial aspect of language is meaning, and the point of non sexist language is not to change the forms of words for the sake of it, but to change the repertoire of meanings a language conveys. Judges, in their decisions, need to take into consideration how gender norms are reenacted in the use of terms such as sexual intercourse, consent, resistance, innocence, and guilt, and become more alert to these terms, rendering examinable, accessible, and negotiable the human rights, dignity, and humanity of women as sexual subjects. Responsibility for crime should be attributable to the rapist and never to the victim, and rape should always be understood as a crime of violence, the encroachment of human rights, humiliation, and inhumane treatment. The problem with the law is that it will obviously lead to certain changes. So at this point in history, you will see things like women who have more financial capital than men, or people of color who might have more financial capital than white people. But obviously, the rise of white nationalism and the kind of almost return to biblical rhetoric to discuss who should be king is obviously a response to changes that would obviously have to happen if one was going to follow the law. So even if you just looked at it statistically, I mean, in a room of 100 people, if 10 of those people have medical degrees and 10 of them do not have a high school diploma, then obviously they will have to compete for jobs and identity will not matter. And so then the room of 100 people could be 100 white men if somebody banned abortion. I mean, so if they already did that, if somebody banned immigration, and then if women could not work or vote. I mean, that would really be how you would have to engineer these results so that white men would be doctors and everything else. Um, so when someone then allows or wants or even actively recruits people from all over the world to immigrate to a country to make money, then I suppose over time these things would change. And when, I mean, the feminist movement obviously is also about capital, and um, when someone has a daughter, all of their savings will go to her tuition so she can get an education. And so then she would work over time. So unless one kind of really goes back in time to the point where the only people who could work are certain groups of people. This is also true of like the killing of Massa Amini. I mean, unless one returns to a different time where only men could work or get an education or go outside, and only certain castes and classes of men, then there will be changes in the class structure, and one would see certain changes. And the reaction to this kind of expected phenomenon is unfortunately, I think, really childish. I mean, even if we think about scientific phenomenon, like, I mean, how long, I mean, a cat and a dog only live for so long, so they're going to die. And then I guess you could buy a new cat and a new dog in different colors. I mean, it's just science itself. Like, things will not remain the same. And when they change and people then turn to white nationalism or the killing of women, um, all it will do is create these kind of shock effects where certain people will move to New York City, or they will run away and go to, say, England because they're scared of white nationalism, or like it will create these small reverberations. But the results will be exactly the same. It's true of science too. I mean, global climate change will happen and someone can try to intervene and it will probably create these small effects, but if something has already been engineered in a certain way, then it will not change. I mean, it's just necessarily like it's kind of like science. I mean, you would think that if you do certain things, there will be certain results. And so if you are not happy with those results, you should not have done those things. And you can't really go back in time. You can only deal with the future. I mean, if somebody, even the lesbian, if people went to a lesbian bar like every night and drank, then there'll be certain scientific results. You can't go back in time. And so you can only move forward. And the moving forward, though, becomes the problem with the rise of white nationalism. That moving forward then is, I suppose, about trying to deport people or trying to create a kind of purity and trying to save jobs for certain groups of people. Um, but it still doesn't really change anything unless one could actually do these things. And I think it's impossible. Um, like the sense of purifying uh, even the world so that there are only kind of pure groups of people and pure families is similar to even attitudes towards like modern healthcare that are really childish. One cannot go back to the past. We cannot return to childhood. We can't return to an imagined past. So it makes sense just to go forward and to go forward thinking about rational modern laws and rational and reasonable behavior. So gender neutrality was recommended in the Justice Verma Committee. So the Justice Verma Committee was this committee set up by this person named Justice Verma, and it was after the Delhi gang rape case. So Justice Verma assembled a whole host of social actors, lawyers, academics, activists, feminists in India to comment on rape law and to try to kind of address all of these problems with rape law. And Arvind Narayan, who is a prominent lawyer and activist in India, discussed gender neutrality and the law. Arvind Narayan discovered three dimensions of gender neutrality, namely gender neutrality with respect to victim, neutrality with respect to the perpetrator, and neutrality with respect to caste, communal wars, custodial, communal, and conflict situations. So Narayan was interested in the definition of the victim um, and the perpetrator. and how this definition, or how and why it is a gender definition, and thinking about caste and other forms of communal identity trouble this idea of gender as being uh, the only hierarchy that organizes power relations. So the recommendations were that the definition of victim should be extended to include men and individuals belonging to third gender as well. Justice Verma Committee reports call for a gender inclusive law for rape victims. Effective of rape on male victims go unnoticed. It's also about the room example, like if you just want one group of people in this room and that's who you'll choose to hire, the room could also be about who has legal rights. So once you have made financial capital from transgender rights, and you have actually passed all these bills and you've elected these people who are transgender politicians, there are transgender actresses and cinema, there's transgender internet moguls, and you've made all this money, then you have to give people rights, or you have to grant some sort of rights, and you also have to deal with this kind of situation you've created. I mean, one cannot pretend that they didn't kind of make money from supporting the existence of certain people who could live in certain cities and states. And so over time, the laws would have to change to protect those people. Even if we thought about it in terms of just capital and running a business, I mean, if you open your business to the public, then you have to be able to serve the public or you can't be in business. So this should also be true of any national context, because what really forms the basis of our relationships in any modern state is capital. So Naren discusses how there are no known instances in India where women have committed sexual assault upon men. But the sense that coercion does not exist, obviously, is really debatable if we think about the marriage system and even capital. I mean, if one of the reasons that heterosexual marriages are so desirable is because of the financial support that women receive from cisgender men, then obviously coercion would be possible. That if someone was poor, if they even had no housing, then they might want to coerce another person into helping them, and even helping them throughout the whole course of their lives. And sex and romantic relationships can be coercive, and women can obviously coerce others into being in relationships with them for their own financial purposes. So the legal framework that governs rape and sexual offenses in India has historically been gender specific, assuming only women as victims and men as perpetrators. However, emerging discourses highlight the need for gender neutral rape laws to protect male, transgender, and non binary individuals from sexual violence. So the coercion, the woman who coerces the man, say, into a sexual relationship, which must turn into a marriage for her own financial purposes, I mean, is a kind of perpetrator in the story, and that is possible. It is similar to child abuse. I mean, it's possible that the entire arranged marriage system can involve people who want to use their children, including their sons, to profit financially and are essentially using their children, are essentially prostituting their children for money. So if you have a son, you might want him to marry someone's daughter who is rich, but you will also profit financially. You'll develop contacts for your whatever industry you work in. You will also have social capital because you will know this other family. And you are essentially doing business with your children, uh, which is similar, I guess, to like it could be termed child prostitution. Um, the idea that there is even consent is highly debatable if one socializes children uh, to believe in these paradigms. And if someone has more choices to make than you do because they have more opportunities, they have more capital, including social capital, then why would they enter into business with you? This is true of any business. I mean, if somebody has, I don't know, $5,000 and you're selling something like a bag that costs $5. They could buy your bag. I suppose they could buy like 100 of your bags. They could obviously buy a better bag. And so if somebody has more capital than you, if they have more social capital than you, if they have more earning power than you, I mean, if they're younger than you, if they are more attractive, if they have all of this capital, then why would they do business with you? They don't have to. And obviously, India is the kind of context where even the ways that people do work in business often involves a sense of coercion, because people are made to obviously feel a sense of guilt or loyalty that is about religion and nationalism. Talked about this before. Uh, India has a large portion of suicides globally, and the highest percentage of women who kill themselves in India. Um, a large proportion of men also kill themselves, and young people kill themselves. And I would argue that the aggressive gendering and the marriage systems are also one of the reasons that suicide is actually common. So, gendering and the lack of kinship between people that is not gendered or is not already coercive and will not really be a lifelong business relationship, which could essentially be a lifelong, like it's essentially forced labor for life. And so, how does one escape what could be termed forced labor, which is gendered and sexual labor for life, to a person they have not consented to being in a relationship with and have essentially been forced, I would say, to marry? They can kill themselves. So in 2018, according to research published in the Lancet Public Health October issue, Indian women make up nearly 30% of global female suicide deaths. Although the rate of death by suicide for Indian women has dropped since 1990, it has not fallen as fast as elsewhere in the world. In 2016, suicide was the ninth leading cause of deaths in India. In many cases, victims were educated, have had successful careers, they belong to the middle class, or they were married. The laws again exist, but the question of money is obviously what sustains these kind of arrangements and the real force enacted against women to be in certain relationships. And suicide becomes a way of fleeing those relationships and all of the relationships that one has had or and continues to have that they really do not want to have and that have been forced. If one had enough financial capital, they could just flee. Finally, I'll finish by discussing the article in greater detail. Kinship is also about capital, and the lesbian bar example is a good example of how people help each other and try to help each other make money so that they can stay in certain cities in the United States and other contexts where these networks exist. Kinship is Kinship is definitely back on the anthropological agenda, but did it ever leave? Anthropology seems sometimes eager to proclaim its hallowed topics passé, to rethink itself only to resurrect those topics later with occasionally self-congratulatory gestures of rediscovery. In what has become something of a conventional narrative, we read that David Schneider's provocative and brilliant critiques were instrumental in displacing formalist and or functionalist analysis of kinship, beginning especially in the 1970s. Of course, this displacement, which one might lump together with a turn toward interpretation, meaning, or indeed culture, was itself displaced by attention to power, inequality, and more recently, transnationalism or the global. Much as we might want to put such terms as kinship and nature under erasure, the new genetics seems sometimes to bring them back with a vengeance. In the context of genetic testing and risk counseling, Finkler writes, people are compelled to recognize consanguinity even when in the lived world they define family by a sense of sameness that may be grounded in friendship or sharing of affect and interest rather than in genes. There are all social trends to which Butler refers. This is a time in which kinship has become fragile, porous, and expansive. Confusion reigns. There is no end of ironies. Think of marriage. It is reified as the natural base of society, and yet it is defended in hateful legislation that actively disenfranchises populations, such as the Defense of Marriage Act in the United States. Indeed, marriage evidently needs government funding over and above any tax incentives for persons to marry and bear children, and in the United States, the Bush administration plans to earmark $100 million for programs that promote it. There are broad implications for the project of anthropology in these developments. By virtue of its supposedly self-evident nature, kinship was once a kind of global context for gathering together disparate phenomena, whether those phenomena were conceived as geographically or temporally separated social systems or societies, or conceived as different kinds of social practices, kin terms naming, marriage prohibitions, patterns of affect within a single such society. Reading Lowy's Primitive Society or Levi Strauss's Elementary Structures, one is swamped with all kinds of ethnographic detail amassed from nearly every corner of the earth, but synthesized within the ethnological project. Still, Butler's focus on intelligibility on what counts as human might reintroduce such a comparative context. In the new kinship studies, as well as the critical cultural studies of science, the human appears to be returning as a proper object of anthropological discourse. Whether or not this reverses the eclipse of anthropology by ethnography remains to be seen. So I'll finish with this quote by Louis Althusser. We discussed ideology throughout the class. What thus seems to take place outside ideology, to be precise, in the street, in reality takes place in ideology. That is why those who are in ideology believe themselves, by definition, outside ideology. One of the effects of ideology is the practical denegation of the ideological character of ideology by ideology. Ideology never says, I am ideological. So when one is participating in gendered ideology, um, they are often not people who would say that they are ideological. And the cisgender heterosexual family and all of its gendering and its class dynamics is deeply ideological. So most of you have handed in the presentation and I have submitted your grades. I'm still waiting for some presentations to be submitted, and the final assignment is due on Friday, July 11th. So that's all. Do you have any questions about the reading, about kinship, or about the assignments? Okay. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I've uploaded the marks for the presentations. They were really well done. Um, I really enjoyed listening to them, and I've given most of you your marks. And please continue to hand in your presentations even if they're late. And the final assignment will be due on Friday. And then 1 week after Friday, I will upload your final grades online. I hope that you have gotten, thank you. I hope you've gotten something out of the class. There are only, today is Wednesday, so there are only 2 more lectures, and then the class will be finished. And so thank you for bearing with the IT issues and for logging on every day and these long lectures. Normally throughout the semester, it would be a lecture that is spread out. And so it's kind of, you're really pressed for time, but you will get the credit in a very short period of time. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.